Hello and welcome to The Time of Telling. I'm Mark Walker, and this podcast is based on my unpublished manuscript, The Time of Telling, John Star Cook and the Word of One Tarot. In the previous episode, John had just visited London with his wife Mary, where he had purchased Aleister Crowley's tarot cards. A friend had advised against the purchase, predicting dire consequences if John went ahead. So, picking up the story, John and Mary were back home in Sunakay by late July 1956. One August morning, John was unable to get out of bed. Brian Gyson recalls, John was cut down literally overnight. He lost the use of his legs, just like that, zap, and he was paralysed. Without any warning signs, polio struck, and John never walked again. For the rest of his deambulant life, however, John resisted the diagnosis of polio. As far as he was concerned, his malady came about through otherworldly means. He had been cursed. John later told Marianne Elen that he thought the condition had something to do with an Algiers insect bite. So many stories. Later still, he blamed Crowley's tarot cards. Mary Cook called Gyson for help. And this is quoting from Gyson, From Here to Go. Mary called me from Algiers, begging me to come up and help John. To come quick. Just close down the restaurant for summer, since business is dead, and come help John, who has been stricken by paralysis. Zap, just like that. The doctors didn't know. There are no doctors because it's August and they have all fled back to Paris for the holidays, and a lot of them will never come back at all because the war is coming right up the front drive of our house, with a curfew enforced between 9 at night and 6 in the morning. We can't move. We can hear them machine gunning in the upper reaches of our property where we're trying to raise pedigree poultry. The rebels are stealing our chickens, unless it's the army or the police. We'll send you the money to close down the restaurant and come. John is asking for you night and day, aren't you, John dear? Yes, you see, you really must come at once. Gyson felt there was no other choice. He was fond of John and heartily fed up with the restaurant business. He had been at it solidly for 2 years, every day without a break, since setting up the business before opening in late 1953. And if Mary was going to provide the money, why not? And so Gyson made all the necessary arrangements to put the 1001 Nights into summer hibernation and flew to Algiers to be by John's side. Gyson says, I liked John a lot, and I was sick of the restaurant business because I'd been at it every single day and night for the 2 years since I'd opened it, not even taking the usual day off a week. We all needed a rest, and the political situation in both Morocco and Algeria looked hopeless. By the time I was on that plane to Algiers, I felt like I was really on the case, playing a role, if you like, what Leary called saving John from the black magicians. Gyson would be the first of several companions for John, disability support workers, over the next 2 decades. Timothy Leary later described Gyson's adventure as one of the great spiritual movies of our time. Leary lauded Gyson for saving John, the great crippled wizard, from the black magicians of Algeria. Unable at first to get a wheelchair, Gyson carried John on his back to the few therapists in Algiers. He recalled, one day at lunch out in the garden, Mary Cook pushed me to the idea of shaving my head, just like John's, saying, that as John was paralysed and I was carrying him about, she said, I think that you would look less odd if you both had your heads shaved and grew sort of little Arab-type beards. She sort of teased me and cajoled me into taking on an aspect of John's image. John was showing no signs of improvement, but had not given up. He never did. John telephoned Ron Hubbard, who was in London, and asked him to come visit and to cure him. Ron had an arcane technique which he assured John would be most efficacious. But Scientology was taking off like nobody's business, and Ron was a busy man. He had no time to spare for his friend, but he sympathised deeply. Ron told them that he had someone who would come to Algeria and apply the secret technique on his behalf. Guyson went to London and brought him back to Sunakay. The new addition to the house was Lucky Jim Skelton, who had been born in Australia but wound up in London in the Scientology scene. Mary seems to have given Jim the same "I think it would look less odd" routine, because he too wound up with cropped hair and a short Arab-style beard. Jim took some photographs of Guyson, who, seeing himself with this new foreign look, was shocked into a realisation. He said, I was somebody who had just changed from somebody who hadn't recognised his own separation from his body image to somebody who recognised this fact. I was not my body image. Guyson continues, those pictures were taken in the original old Turkish wing of a huge colonial villa on the coast about 9 kilometres outside of Algiers in 1956 during the Algerian War. My friend John Cook was married to the lady who had bought the place up and done all of the improvements on it, like air conditioning and indoor swimming pool, etc. I was posing, of course, says Guyson. I was playing along in these rich kids' magic charade, and after years of restaurant keeping, I was swept away by the amount of money that was changing hands. Guyson, a famed misogynist, seemed frightened of Mary and had a pet name for her, Scary Mary. But she made him, with the haircut routine, consider who he actually was. To all appearances, he, and now Jim too, could pass for John. Jim Skelton settled into life at Sunakay and set about making John walk again. He applied the secret technique taught to him by Ron and met with early and encouraging signs. John's son Chamba recalls being told that Jim was able to push out some of the paralysis, but was unable to get past a certain point. Jim called Ron, and they had a discussion about the secret technique. According to Jim, the reason he couldn't proceed further with good results from using the technique was because the technique was not perfect. It needed more work. Ron was furious and said that the reason it wasn't working was because Jim wasn't doing it properly. It was a standoff. This was the point where not only Jim and Ron parted company, but from this time forward, both John and Mary too were no longer involved with Ron or Scientology. Guyson adds a further glib remark, which is chilling in light of the head shaving requirements of the household at Sunakay. He says, Beach Boy friends from Franco Beach turned out to be terrorists who killed our local barber because he talked too much. The Sunakay mansion had an indoor swimming pool, and Guyson helped John to swim each day. Guyson describes the Sunakay scene. The house was huge and well known. People came in droves, although we didn't know any of them personally. People will go anywhere for free food and drink, especially in wartime. And the Algerian War was raging away practically on our doorstep. John Cook told me fascinating things about a $1 billion scam he was onto called Scientology, whose leaders were L. Ron and Mary Sue Hubbard. The names alone were enough to make me laugh myself sick, but who was I to have an opinion when my restaurant was coming apart under me? They, John and Mary, were keen on making me into an auditor, claiming that I was a natural clear and a born operating thetan. They counted on me to start a big drive on the French captive audience we could get every time we gave a party. When guests came over, they had to stay all night because of the curfew. Nevertheless, Guyson was keen to escape. He wrote from Sunakay to Alice B. Toklas in Paris, telling of half-baked plans of an exhibition of his paintings, and she responded, "Though your new address doesn't give me too much confidence, it was an enormous relief to hear from you, from anywhere." Mary was pregnant, and we'll have a few words here about the sex lives of the Cooks. In Brian Gyson's The Process, John's alter ego Faye Himmer and his wife Maya engage in IMSAC, a method of lengthy sexual congress as a means of stepping outside the constraints of time to exist in present time. What is real can be only real in present time, and that is what IMSAC is all about. The consort withholds the queen bee in perpetual present time on the prong of his prick. In later years, Brian Gyson, speculating on why John was suddenly paralysed, posited spooky sex. The Cooks' sex lives were such that they welcomed Jim into their home, fully welcomed Jim into their home. However, with the due date bearing down to parenthood, Mary came to realise that not only did John have an unknown path before him with regard to his polio, neither was he cut out for fatherhood. His child with Millen was a stranger. Mary considered Jim to be a better prospect as a life partner and father figure for the babe to be, and so that was that. Chamba Star Cook, all-round good guy, was born 3rd of October 1956. Brian Gyson was present for the birth and was Chamba's godfather. John made no mention of the new marital arrangements when he wrote to his sister Alice on the 14th of October 1956. Brian, our Tangier friend, is with us now. He is marvellous to have around. Besides lugging me around and helping arrange things for the baby, shopping, etc., he is writing a very good, if very shocking, book, which will be published next year. With Scientology unable to provide a cure, other options were explored. It was decided that John would go to Paris for medical attention and that Gyson would accompany him. Gyson must have made note of the fact that it would be coming up for winter and he didn't have appropriate clothing, because he later reported that at this time Scary Mary gave him a fine sweater, such that he would never be able to afford. John was treated at the American Hospital in Paris, where he was diagnosed with polio. John refrained from sharing this information with Alice when he wrote to her on the 15th of December. He had been there for 2 days and he was bored. He complained about having my malady named. None of my friends were happy with it unnamed, so I am having a big label tied on. He remarked that Alice B. Toklas would be visiting the next day. John reported to his sister Alice that the last month at Sunakay had been hell, and that he had come to loathe Scientology, although adding that it could be helpful for others in some cases. Alice had asked John and company to pack up and come to Kentfield, where she could care for him. But John had not given up on his legs, nor on miracles. If his plight had such a sudden onset, it could have an equally sudden offset. John considered staying with John G. Bennett and the Gurdjieff people at Coombe Springs. He told Alice, "Bennett claims he can have me completely healed in a year." Meanwhile, the Meher Baba group and the former Sulphur Mountain continued to be an enduring complication for John. He asked Alice, "Has Egbert signed over Meher Mount yet in my name to Agnes?" The situation would not be fully resolved for another 3 years. This is something we'll have to go into later. The Meher Baba movement, the Meher Mount property, and John's involvement in this. John was set on the miraculous, but with the means to avail himself to the best medical facilities, he did so, which meant moving to Denmark. The polio epidemic was being met head-on at Blegdam Hospital in Copenhagen. Blegdam Hospital was designated a fever hospital in 1952. The iron lung was imported from Harvard, and it was at Blegdam that the modern ventilator was devised. It was a hub for research and treatment, and so after 3 weeks at the American Hospital in Paris, Guyson made the arrangements and put John on a plane to Copenhagen. Guyson returned to Sunakay and provided everyone with the latest information with regard to John's condition, and then was back in Tangier by late December. Things had gone badly for the 1001 Nights while Guyson was away, and he had great difficulty opening the restaurant. The liquor had all been drunk, some of the furniture had been sold off, and a substantial amount of back pay was owing to one employee. Jim and Mary turned up and offered to help. Mary, Jim, and Chamba were now a separate unit. Jim and Mary were married in early 1957. Their solution for Guyson involved them buying into the business, but they refused to work with Humry, who was sent on holidays for 3 months and then paid out of the business to the tune of $10,000 by Guyson. This money came from Jim and Mary, but came with strings attached. Humry took his musicians away and simply set up another cafe. Guyson had to find almost entirely new staff, and it took him the best part of a year to get the show back on the road. The 1001 Nights did not reopen until after summer 1957. William Burroughs, meanwhile, reported in a letter to Allen Ginsberg on the 8th of December 1957, "Brian Guyson has opened the 1001 Nights with a troupe of sorry dancing boys, all with ferret faces and narrow shoulders and bad teeth." Indeed, the 1001 Nights was open again, but it would not last long. While Guyson was preparing to reopen, he made an alarming discovery in a kitchen ventilator. He says, "While getting the restaurant ready, I found a magic object, which was an amulet of sorts. The amulet contained 7 round speckled pebbles, 7 big seeds in their pods, 7 shards of mirror, which surrounded a small square paper packet, barely dusted over with soot, and inside was the text, written in rusty ink from right to left across the square of paper, which had been turned on its side and written again to form a Kabbalistic grid. The invocation, when I, Gyson, got it hazily made out, called on the jinn of the hearth, "May Massa Brahim leave this house as the smoke leaves this fire, never to return." Gyson says that within a very short time he lost the restaurant and everything else. Jim and Mary Skelton had pulled their string and helped him right out of the restaurant business. Brian was no longer a part of the dream he had created. "You can go now," Mary is reported to have said, and Gyson said that he cried for the first time in memory. And there I was, out in the street, with nothing but what I wore on my back. And all of this to explain why Gyson felt a little uncertain about Mitch visiting him in 1964 at the Beat Hotel. Gyson was still stung and somewhat mystified by his experience at the 1001 Nights. Gyson seems to have included John as a player in the drama of the loss of the 1001 Nights, and as such found it hard to understand why John would be introducing someone to him. After some time in Paris with Gyson, Mitch moved on to Ibiza, where he spent the summer. By the end of June, Gyson had relocated to Tangier. John, meanwhile, had made the move to Mexico. By August, he was residing in Cuernavaca, Morelos in Mexico. He arrived with Martin Green as his support worker, and at first they lived in the Acapanzingo district of Cuernavaca. John had many friends in Mexico, and in the garden of a house owned by one of these friends, Fausto Garcia Medeles, famed music teacher and pianist, on the outskirts of a village named Jutepec, half an hour out from Cuernavaca, John, along with Martin and 3 others, took a high dose of LSD. John seems to have had a stash of LSD. Who knows where it could have come from? John confided in Alice, "I no longer care what anyone thinks. LSD is a purposeful discovery at this time, come upon in order to liberate man, to show him who or what he is. Ye are gods is no idle saying. We are gods, and everything to the last and minutest detail we project along our individual paths. We are there all the time, through all time, seated beneath our tree as it was in the beginning a la Genesis, and here we still are." A month later, John again wrote to Alice with more observations about LSD. He told her of hierarchies of people on LSD. For instance, the God plane was where Alice, Joy, Martin, Len, and John dwelt, each as an incarnate Buddha. John was painting the cards again, whether this was completion of the earlier paintings or if they were new works is unclear. John makes reference to Alice of those charming representatives of the here and now, the Beatles. The Beatles themselves at this point had just recently been introduced to marijuana by Bob Dylan. Speaking of insects, one autumn day in Akapanzingo, John was sitting beside the pool when an enormous fly bit him on his shoulder wound as well as on his hand. Once again, the shoulder needed to be operated upon, as did the hand, and these operations were deemed successful, and for a time things went well. One day, John and Martin went to see The Longest Day. John made some observations to Alice. He noted the game of killing, levels and levels of games. The leaders, generals and privates, all with their games. Are we always going to be the subject of this level of game playing? Can't we do something about it? What? LSD, for one thing, would spoil the game. One sees how useless outer games are, but I think that is why there has been so much talk against it. In general, people do not want to change the hallucination. How to wake them up? Do nothing? Yes, 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 do nothing, a little voice says. Mitch moved on from Ibiza and accidentally visited Tangier. It was a short stay, but he vowed to return before heading on to Amsterdam and then to Berlin, where he worked for the winter. John had recently received a gift from Peter in Nepal, 2 Lhasa Apso puppies. This breed was still quite a rarity outside of Tibet and had only first appeared in the US in the 1930s. The puppies had been born in a Tibetan monastery. John named them Om Mani and Padme Hum. John had a penchant for the Tibetan trappings, but on leaving Carmel Highlands had to part with some treasures. John asked Alice for the address of Dr. Radar Wenneslan, who owed him money for a Tibetan tanka. John says, I'd rather not let him have my address, as I don't want all those beats to make it and appear on the scene. Dr. Wenneslan was continuing to build up his substantial collection of American beat paintings. But despite John's best efforts to avoid the beats, 4 months later he reported to Alice, the latest here is that Martin and I are moving. People were beginning to find me, and I heard that a large exodus was in process from California. So John made arrangements with Fausto to rent his house in Huitepec. John and Martin moved there around February 1965. At Fausto's, John wrote and Martin painted. John composed a 3-act comedy based upon real people telling Alice it probably won't be able to be produced until they pass on. This time it is the Caudrys. It is called The Swimming Pool. John was exasperated with Rosalind, even from so far away. Of course, I've heard that Madame Fu Manchu Wall called you finally. Psychologically, I simply cannot take her on again. He reported on Peter, who had now yet another name. He was now Ngawangkang Sonan Tenzin. Sorry about that. A name given to him by the Sakya Lama. Peter was at first the secretary to the Sakya Lama before becoming a Buddhist monk. And interestingly, John makes the following remark to Alice. Leary by the way, is with Lama Govinda, now in the Himalayas. Interesting. This remark indicates that both John and Alice were familiar with both Timothy Leary and Lama Govinda. Lama Govinda was born in Germany as Ernst Hoffmann and became a Buddhist at 18. By the early 1930s, he was living as a monk in Sri Lanka and India. In the late 1940s, he married and moved to Kasar Devi near Almora in northern India. It was here that Leary and Ralph Metzner came. Kasar Devi was already known as a bohemian place. Leary came to John's attention 18 months earlier when he and colleague Richard Alpert were essentially sacked by Harvard. Leary and Alpert had begun extracurricular activities in 1963 by establishing the International Federation for Internal Freedom, which had hundreds of members, including Mitch's friends Bob and Connie. The Harvard Crimson reported that the If intended to buy a hotel in Mexico and transform it into a year-round psychedelic retreat center. The hotel was in Zihuatanejo, a sleepy little coastal town which Alpert had noticed earlier while flying his plane, and where they had held a 6-week psychedelic retreat in summer 1962. By the 27th of May 1963, the game was up for Leary and Alpert when their contracts at Harvard were not renewed. Nevertheless, If continued its activities and again hosted the psychedelic retreat at Zihuatanejo. The retreat was run along the same lines as the previous year, but this time medical authorities complained to the government about Leary giving out drugs. The Mexican government sent in 2 undercover agents, and the end result was the entire psychedelic colony was deported from Mexico. However, many people had paid to have a retreat, so the next few months were spent undertaking these retreats. First in Antigua, from where they were deported, and then Dominica, from where they were also deported. By this point, Leary and the If were in a poor state of affairs, but luckily, Peggy Hitchcock came to the rescue. Peggy Hitchcock was a trust fund kid who did not like the money crowd. She had found LSD to be a great help to her brother Billy, who had been turned on to LSD by Alpert and used the experience to conquer an alcohol problem. Billy and his twin brother Tommy had invested in a 2,000-acre farm in upstate New York, where they raised cattle. The property had several residences, including a gatehouse, a 64-room mansion, and a large bungalow. Since the twins only used the bungalow, Peggy thought the vacant mansion would be a perfect fit for the If. Billy was interested in their work, so he offered it to them at a nominal rent. In September 1963, Leary, Alpert, Metzner, and a core group of about 30 people moved to the Hitchcock estate near the village of Millbrook. The If was disbanded and replaced with another organisation, the Castalia Foundation, named after the intellectual colony in Hermann Hesse's The Glass Bead Game. The members of the Castalian Foundation led a communal life in the mansion at Millbrook and utilised mystical practices to complement and enhance the psychedelic experience. For a time, they were largely undisturbed. In November 1964, Ralph Metzner of the Castalian Foundation set an early trend when he went to India on a pilgrimage. Michael Hollingshead, who had introduced Leary to LSD some years earlier, had just moved into Millbrook. Leary and Nina, who were married in an LSD session wedding in December, joined Metzner in India in early 1965. Metzner met Leary and Nina and took them to Lama Govinda in the Himalayas, holding an LSD session at the Taj Mahal under a full moon before they set off. Leary had brought with him 9 English translations of the Tao Te Ching, which he adapted and released in his own translation later in the year. It's not certain how John knew of Leary's whereabouts, but John was certainly interested in LSD. He evidently had a supply of the stuff, and later in the year expressed a wish to know what Leary and his colleagues were up to. Perhaps he was already keeping an eye on Leary. As far as LSD goes, things were being dialed up a few notches. Whereas up to now, the great majority of the supply had come from official sources, it was now being produced by independent chemists. Ergotamine tartrate was becoming harder to source from the few European countries who produced it. But where there was a will, there was a way. Augustus Owsley Stanley III, known as Bear, and Melissa Cargill released their first batch onto the streets of San Francisco and beyond in early March 1965. Mitch, meanwhile, tired of grey Berlin, made for the sun with his savings via the Orient Express to Istanbul and a ferry to Egypt. Mitch had seen a billboard in the grey winter of Berlin with sun and pyramids and blue sky, and as an advert for the Orient Express. So that's how he got to Istanbul, then to Egypt. He spent a month making his way across North Africa, experiencing spiritual states all the way, from Egypt to Tangier, where he remained for 8 months. Mitch recalls one day at the Café de Paris, where he felt a laser burn of attention. Someone was looking at him on the back of his neck. He turned around to see Gysin talking secretively to William Burroughs, but there was no contact with Mitch. Mitch had the feeling that Gysin was saying, "Friend of Cook's." Gysin had begun writing what would become The Process, which he later described as a fiction based on prophecy of future fact. A fiction based on prophecy of future fact. The Process was a fictionalized version of Tangier 10 years earlier, with alter egos of Gysin himself, Muhammad Hamri, John Cook, Mary Cook, Axel Jensen, and possibly other actual people. John continued to report to Alice of his psychedelic adventures. The day after he finished painting The Way Shower, John and Martin had both taken LSD and seen a great twinkling light that swings and dips across the stars. It returned the following night, and John described it to Alice as one of our lights from Carmel. This would suggest that John and Alice had witnessed UFOs in Carmel at some stage. John continues, "From indications under LSD, a very big breakthrough is coming, in which a man, at any rate, will know and change the whole works. Who it will be, who knows, but willy-nilly, I am aiming at the jackpot. I believe 7 will make it, actually." John was very happy at Fausto's stone-walled house in Huitepec, where the desert meets the jungle. There was no telephone to disturb the serenity, and no constant hum from any refrigerator. It was a 2-bedroom house, but John slept in the living room. One bedroom was made into a library/painting studio for Martin, and the other bedroom was for guests. Martin slept upstairs in the separate servants' quarters, and Letty, the maid, slept in the downstairs section. But aside from sleeping, life was spent outdoors. There was a patio and a terrace with a roof where all could listen to the thunder in the rainy season, hear the crickets, see the fireflies and iguanas, and experience the mosquito multitudes. There was a nearby waterfall and river, and below the house was a creek with mango trees beyond and a banana grove before. John was thriving. He said to Alice, "I am working better than I ever have and feeling better than in years." And I think that's where we'll leave it for today. Thank you very much for watching. This is the time of telling.